Hey, Timothy here. So I'm going over another spotlight card here from Shadows over Innistrad, just to give you kind of a timeline. Pre-release is already passed. It's the Wednesday before release day, so we'll actually start getting to draft this set in a couple days. Start playing a little bit more sealed with everything. So I've touched the format. Obviously, I'm no expert, but there are still cards to put in the spotlight, cards that I think are going to be very exciting. I have a couple more that I know for a fact I'm going to do video for, but right now we're looking at Thing in the Ice. This is a card that's caught quite a bit of buzz as a potential eternal format card. Also probably going to see play in Standard. It's a very good card, but obviously, as usual, I'm looking at it from a limited perspective. So I'm thinking, if I first pick this card in draft, what am I looking to do with it? It's definitely an awesome card, so let's go ahead and look at it and see what it does first, in case you've been living under a rock, or trapped in ice, I guess. So the front side of the card, Thing in the Ice, is a 2-mana 0/4 defender. When it enters the battlefield, you put 4 ice counters on it, or rather it enters with 4 ice counters on it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you remove an ice counter from Thing in the Ice. Then, if there are no more counters on it, no more ice counters on it, you transform it into Awoken Horror. This is a 7/8 Kraken Horror, which already is huge. But in addition, when the creature transforms into Awoken Horror, return all non-horror creatures to their owner's hands. Pretty awesome card here. So what we have on the front side is this early blocker. Obviously, we want to get to Awoken Horror because I would almost never play a 0/4 defender for 2. It's just not a good card. But it does block early, so if you're playing against a very aggressive deck or a card that's just trying to push in early damage, this is going to do a good job of stemming the bleeding while you're still working towards a goal. It's kind of nice that Thing in the Ice is a long game card that works in the early game to kind of get you there by blocking. Your opponent's going to send a lot of removal at this probably, especially when the counters start knocking off of it. But in the early game, this is going to do a good job of what a 0/4 would normally do. You obviously want to work towards Awoken Horror. That's your end game here, but Thing in the Ice works just fine as on the front side until you get to flip it up. It is a reset button when you flip it up, and I'll talk more about this later because it's not a 100% reset button, but it's always nice to have these cards that kind of wipe the field or send everything back to their hand, but still leave you up. This is very similar to something like Surge of Tentacles or Descent upon the Sinful, where you're kind of resetting the game, but you've got the advantage of the big creature on your side. A 7/8 is huge. That's what I mean by game end in power / toughness. 7/8 is really big if you look at the format. In fact, I can't think of any creatures that kind of have that much of a spread except for Ormondal, maybe a couple others, but even red-green werewolves don't flip into creatures this big. It's absolutely huge. 7/8 is going to win you the game, especially if it bounces all the creatures. And as a matter of fact, as long as Thing in the Ice is untapped, the turn you transform this up, you can probably attack with it, which means you're wiping the board, you're sending all your opponent's creatures back to their hands, and then you get to smash for 7. This is not an Eldrazi format, so a 7/8 is absolutely a huge deal. Pretty crazy. And I just love the name, Thing in the Ice. I thought it was a little bit cheeky. I thought it was kind of a mock-up name, but it turns out that's the real name of the card, so I love it. The design is awesome. The card is awesome, but we need to really figure out how to enable it best in Limited. Obviously, you're not just going to take Thing in the Ice and grab a bunch of instants and sorceries because you still want to play a consistent deck. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So, what I'm looking at here are kind of the best builds that I think you can do if you pick up Thing in the Ice really early and you know that's your game plan. The first thing I like to look at is the best kind of cards to work towards flipping it in a long game. And these are going to be pretty much your draw spells, cards that dig you deeper while still casting instants or sorceries, the type of cards you would normally play in a blue deck anyway. You'll notice a lot of cards on this PowerPoint as we're going through them are blue, which is great because it works with Thing in the Ice's color. And it's just natural that blue does this best. Where there are examples that are relevant, I'm going to try and throw in other colors, like Merciless Resolve is a draw spell in black that still counts towards one of your instant sorceries. But cards like Epiphany at the Drowned Yard, Nagging Thoughts, they're going to dig you deeper and they're going to remove an ice counter when you cast them. So the idea here is that you want to fill your deck, not completely, but with a lot of relevant cards that remove ice counters and still get you towards other things. Still fueling a game plan while removing ice counters, not just casting instants and sorceries for the sake of doing so, but giving you an alternative game plan of triggering Thing in the Ice's removal counters, counter removal, while at the same time progressing an alternative game plan. Pieces of the Puzzle is actually a really nice card for this kind of deck. If you ask me, Pieces of the Puzzle is not normally the type of card I would play because of the chance of missing, but if you have a deck that has a much higher concentration of instants and sorceries than your normal deck, it's actually really, really sweet, especially if you can pick up 2 more cards, because that's 2 more counters you're removing over the course of a couple turns. Having already moved 1 counter to cast Pieces of the Puzzle. Same with cards like Epiphany at the Drowned Yard, Merciless Resolve. They're just going to dig you deeper. They're going to put more cards in your hand, and they're going to remove an ice counter when you cast it. Draw spells are kind of the way to go here. Of course, you still need a nice balance of creatures. You need cards that do something besides just draw you cards, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and then have all these cards when you don't have Thing in the Ice, something like that. Worst case scenario. The best case scenario is to turn to Thing in the Ice and then just follow up with a bunch of spells like this. Chain them together and very quickly flip your Awoken Horror before your opponent has a response to it. One other thing that's pretty nice, and I'm not sure this is the best route to go, is the way that counter spells interact with the card. Every time you cast a counter spell, presumably you're countering something relevant, so you're hindering your opponent's game plan, but at the same time, the counter spells get rid of one of the ice counters. They are instants. Most of these counter spells are a little bit on the wonky side. None of them are really cards I would normally main board. Broken Concentration is not a particularly amazing card, even though it's a fine main deckable card if you like counter spells. Same goes for Confirm Suspicions. Deny Existence I see more as a sideboard card against creatures I know for a fact I can't beat. Normally, I advise against playing counter spells, but when your counter spells are doing something in addition to just countering things, I like them a little bit more. So these play very nicely with the ice counters by removing counters off of Thing in the Ice, while at the same time progressing your game plan, or at least hindering your opponent's game plan. The same goes for cards like Pick the Brain that deal with your opponent's things while still doing it in such a way that's going to remove these ice counters from the cards. Do I suggest that you pick up every counter spell? No. But it at least means that these counter spells have a main deckable plausibility to them when you have Thing in the Ice in your deck, whereas normally I would keep them in the sideboard. Another route to go, and probably the best route to go, is to pick up cards that give you creatures in the form of instants or sorceries. So by creature spells, I mean instants or sorceries that are going to give you creatures. This lets you up your instant and sorcery count without affecting your ability to interact with your opponent. So here, examples across all colors include cards like Shambleback, which is a sorcery, so you're getting rid of an ice counter, but it also nets you a creature. So your creature count might be a little bit lower in your deck, but you're still getting creatures, you're still actually putting up a defense, and in some games just winning off your other creatures. This lets you progress an actual game plan while still working towards the alternative route of flipping up Awoken Horror and just smashing with it. It is a little awkward that when Awoken Horror flips up, it's probably going to wipe most of these tokens, but that's fine because your end game is the 7-8 smasher, not necessarily the tokens. The same goes for kind of Traverse the Ulvenwald, Macabre Waltz. These aren't cards that necessarily immediately put creatures into play, but they're very cheap ways to fuel your hand up with creatures while still casting instants and sorceries. Traverse the Ulvenwald obviously has to have Delirium for that to work, but you get the idea. You're searching up creatures, you're playing creatures, or you're making tokens in the form of casting instants or sorceries. It's kind of a double game plan. Remove ice counters while still getting creatures. One card I included here, because I thought it did something really interesting, was Not Forgotten. I don't actually know how powerful this card's going to be, but it's a sorcery for 2 mana. You put a card on the top or bottom of its owner's library, and then you get a 1/1 spirit creature token. The reason I put this here is because if you have 2 of them, you can actually loop them with each other. So you can use Not Forgotten, and then the next Not Forgotten you cast can put the first one back on top of your deck. So you can continuously cycle them. You get a spirit every time, so you get a blocker or an attacker or whatever you're doing with that spirit. But at the same time, you are casting a sorcery, a definite sorcery every turn. Neat little combo. I don't know how practical it is since Not Forgotten isn't uncommon. This is a large set and you need 2 of them plus Thing in the Ice to really go off. But I like to look at implausible scenarios too. It's really cool, and like I said, I don't know how powerful this card is yet, but I have my eye on it, and I like the fact that there's this kind of a reciprocity or this kind of loop you can do with the card, which really works with these spell matters type cards we're talking about, particularly Thing in the Ice. Alright, and then as an alternative, I have to look at what you should not be doing. Because what I find is when there's a card like this that really wants you to play a certain type of game, people like to force that game. So what Thing in the Ice asks of you is to cast instants and sorceries. Well, that's not really a good excuse to just go play in bad instants or sorceries, because you really want your deck to work out just in case you don't draw Thing in the Ice. So I would not jam your deck with every instant or sorcery you saw, just because you can. I would not play these weird sideboard cards in the main deck just for the sake of flipping up Thing in the Ice. Don't force the card to happen. If your only route to flipping it is these bad instants or sorceries or these sideboard cards, I would just call it quits and say maybe it's not going to work out this time. This is very similar to a card, Relic Seeker, in Magic Origins, I believe. It was a renowned creature, and it said whenever this creature dealt damage to your opponent, it became renowned, and then you get to search your deck for an equipment. Well, what I saw was a lot of people were playing that card, and then they would just play this really bad equipment card in their deck simply because they had a way to go fetch it just to get value off of Relic Seeker. Relic Seeker was fine on its own. I don't really think you need to go out of the way. The same thing here kind of applies to, like, Open the Armory. I'm not going to play some bad equipment in my deck and open the armory just for the sake of casting a sorcery for Thing in the Ice. It's just not going to work. Liliana's Indignation, again, another card I don't really have a read on how powerful it is, but it strikes me as not very good. It doesn't really affect the game immediately, and it doesn't do enough off of one card, I think, to justify its spot. Not to mention, it doesn't really work well with Thing in the Ice since you want a spell-heavy deck and you're going to hit less creatures off of it. I would not play these cards just for the sake of it. I know I said counter spells are decent, but Invasive Surgery is strictly a sideboard card. It just sits in your hand sometimes. Same with Root Out, and Chaplain's Blessing to me is one of the most unplayable cards in the set, even against super aggro decks. But if that's the route you're going, well, mercy on you. I don't know how I feel about it, but I don't think it's going to work out well. I will point out before I go on from this, something like Invasive Surgery, if you really have your deck set up in a certain way, you can actually counter your own spell just to move 2 counters off of Thing in the Ice. It's a little bit desperate, a little bit wonky, but the option is there. For instance, if I have 2 counters left on Thing in the Ice and my goal is just to flip it as soon as possible, maybe I need to flip it to stop myself from losing, or I know for a fact it's going to win the game, I can play a spell and then immediately counter it. That removes 2 counters, one for the original spell, one for the counter spell. It's an option that's there. I don't recommend going that route unless you have to, but keep that in mind in case you are playing a counter spell heavy version. One nice thing here is that there's kind of this mini theme of spells matters in the set. It's delegated mostly to blue with a little bit of red, but these cards here, they get a lot better when you're playing them alongside Thing of the Ice, and they're already playable cards on their own. Pyrehound, Trail of Evidence, Silberlin Snapper, and Aberrant Researcher simply ask that you have a lot of spells to cast in your deck for them to be good. I think they're all decent cards, with some of them being better than others, but they get a lot better when your game plan is to flip Thing in the Ice. Again, the creatures are probably going to bounce when you flip it, but at least your deck is more consistent when you have more cards that care about you casting instants or sorceries. For instance, Trail of Evidence, probably the worst card on this list here, gets a lot better when your deck is a high concentration of instants or sorceries, and also feels that first game plan I was talking about where you're using the tokens, the Investigate Clue tokens, to dig closer to your other spells. So keep that in mind. If you are in blue with Thing in the Ice, maybe blue-red is the best build for it, simply because you can put these other decent playable cards in it alongside it and have an alternative game plan to work around. Alright, I said I would get back to the part about not being a complete board wipe, and the reason I say that is because I think a lot of people, they look at Thing in the Ice and they see it as, when Thing in the Ice flips into Awoken Horror, send all creatures back to their opponent's hands, or back to their owner's hands. And that's not quite how it's worded. It specifically says, bounce all non-horror creatures. Well, here's a list of all the non-mythic horror creatures in the set, with there actually being 2 mythics that are also horrors. As you see, there's a ton of blue ones, mostly zombies. There's some green ones, there's some red ones, there's an artifact, there's even a black creature that costs 6 mana that's a horror. There are a lot of horrors floating around at common, uncommon, and even rare. And the fact of the matter is, this is both helpful when you have Thing in the Ice, and can be pretty hurtful when you have it as well. So if you're really relying on bouncing your opponent's field and they have one of these creatures up, it makes your Thing in the Ice a little bit worse when it flips, because they're still going to have creatures on the battlefield. At the same time, if you're up against a deck that's playing Thing in the Ice, these creatures get a lot better in your deck. I like Lone Dryad in particular because it lets you do something with Thing in the Ice. Normally it's just a defender, and if it's not blocking, it's just a card that's sitting there. Well, Lone Dryad lets you tap that Thing in the Ice for mana, which is pretty nice. Some of these are a little bit of a stretch, like Scourge Wolf I don't see playing alongside it very often, but most of these cards would slot into the same deck very nicely. Stonewing Antagonizer is a flip card artifact that's going to go in most decks with Thing in the Ice, alongside all of these blue cards, which all seem playable, very strong in their own individual decks. None of these cards on this list are unplayable, with Lone Dryad perhaps being the weakest and most of a stretch. But outside of white, there are plenty of options for cards to make your deck more synergistic while still working towards that game plan. The only thing I can imagine that's worse than just flipping up an Awoken Horror and smashing with it is flipping up Awoken Horror while having other creatures that don't get bounced and smashing with everything. I'm imagining like having a perfected form when I flip up Awoken Horror and smashing for 12. Yeah, it just seems unbeatable at that rate. But there are options to make your deck better. And like I said, all these creatures are pretty decent, so I wouldn't mind playing them alongside Thing in the Ice. And of course, I like to look at these kind of wombo combos, things that don't come together very well and involve multiple rares. But there are 2 Spell Matters rares that I noticed in this set that work pretty nice with Thing in the Ice. The first is Brain in a Jar, and I don't think Brain in the Jar is a very good rare. I'm not usually happy to pull it, and I imagine it's going to get passed very late. So if you have Thing in the Ice, there's a decent chance you might be able to pick up a Brain in the Jar. But what this lets you do is kind of cast your spells free of charge, given certain circumstances and setup. But it works very nicely. It is actually casting the spell, so it does count towards getting rid of one of those ice counters. It's a little bit unreliable, and you have to, like I said, set it up in a way that the number of charge counters is equal to the spell cost, or the converted mana cost of the card you're casting. But it's a nice little interaction there. Harness the Storm is another card which I think is generally bad, but if you have a particular instant or sorcery that you have just tons of copies of, maybe 3 or 4, Harness the Storm actually lets you do something cool. When you cast an instant or sorcery, if you have another one of those in your graveyard with the same name, you actually get to cast that card from your graveyard. Notice the key here is that you don't make a copy and cast a copy. You actually cast the card from your graveyard, which means that when you cast the original card that triggers Harness the Storm, you remove an ice counter, and then when you trigger that extra copy from your graveyard, you remove another ice counter since you're technically casting 2 spells. Again, this requires your deck to be very specific, and I would probably avoid both these cards if I weren't playing Thing in the Ice. But it's nice to know that there are kind of weird combos there, and if the dream really is to pull off Harness the Storm with like a spell that I have 4 copies of. Again, don't go chasing these weird bad sorceries and instants just because you have cards that make them a little bit better. Play good cards, play cards that feel a theme, and really make it work out. So just to summarize everything I've said, the pros, there is on-color support. There are a lot of blue cards that work with this blue finisher, particularly the horrors, the zombie horrors that are in blue, and they're all playable cards. So the fact that Thing in the Ice is blue is really nice. If it were like a black card, it would be a lot worse because there are not so many black cards that work well in a synergistic deck with it. It scales very nicely into the late game. It starts off as an early blocker, so it blocks a lot of damage, saves you a lot of life in the early game, and then it actually works as your finisher, which is really, really cool. And the fact that it's a reset button, I love having these reset buttons in my deck. They give me a way out of certain impossible situations that I know for a fact I would lose if I didn't have access to this card. On the flip side, no pun intended, this requires a very specific deck. If you have a deck that only ends up having 4 or 5 instants or sorceries, you're probably never flipping the card. Also, Thing in the Ice gets worse the later the game goes because you've already cast your instants or sorceries. And this note at the bottom is true for pretty much any of these game win and flip cards. It is super, super vulnerable to bounce spells and blank spells. If your opponent lets you get down to 1 counter and then they play just the win and bounce it to your hand, you have to start over from 4 counters, and it's probably not happening. So your best bet is to make sure you can chain off as many instants or sorceries as you can before your opponent has a way to deal with Thing in the Ice, because they're going to have a much, much harder time dealing with a 7-8 than they will with an 0-4. So be careful of playing against other opponents who are perhaps playing blue, since they have access to more blink spells and bounce spells, and that makes your flip cards a lot worse. So Thing in the Ice, not unbeatable, but against an unattested board, it's probably going to win you the game. So overall, I would say this card is a bomb, but it does require specific build-around strategy. Although, I think this set has supported it nicely enough that you can pull this off most of the time. It's going to be a shame when you get down to 1 counter and then your opponent finds their answer. But if they don't have the answer, you just get to smash them while bouncing all their creatures to the field, which I imagine feels very, very nice. I hope somebody has a story about pre-release that involves Thing in the Ice, because I didn't really see any around my game store. But there you go, Thing in the Ice, Awoken Horror, a card that's caused quite a bit of buzz from this set, both in Standard and Legacy, I believe. People think it might go in Delver decks, but that's a story for another person, somebody who pays a little bit more time to construct it. Thank you guys for watching. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. I'll be back eventually with another one of these videos. I think I know what card I'm going to do next, one that I was really, really impressed with at pre-release. But if you have any cards in particular that you think deserve to be in the spotlight, let me know in the comments, and I'll get back to you. Let me know what you think of Thing in the Ice and Awoken Horror, and let me know if you saw any strategies that I might have missed out on. Alright, till next time, I'll see you guys later.